Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. For criminal defense lawyers, every trial is an away game. You're an underdog, and the odds against you are very, very long. It's hard to get a victory in a criminal defense trial. When you walk into a courtroom, a judge's courtroom, facing a judge who may or may not know you, you're in another county or anything like that, and the prosecutor in the case is somebody who's been working there for days, weeks, or months. So they feel they're part of a team, and you're an outsider, and these are the things that you're up against. In any event, I got a case to defend a lady who was right out of Central Casting as a California woman. She was very, very pretty, middle-aged gal, very trim, athletic, blonde hair, nice suntan. Problem was, she was a thoroughbred horse trainer who had come east to bring some horses to Belmont and Aqueduct to race them for some big stakes. She was charged with DWI, driving while intoxicated, assault on a police officer, which I thought was pretty uncharacteristic, and you never know, and resisting arrest. And there was no plea. There was no reasonable plea offer, in spite of the fact that this lady had a clean record. She had never done anything. She was a respected, highly respected horse trainer and everything else, thoroughbreds. And maybe because of the fact that she had come from California and the vehicle involved had California plates, it was her pickup truck. And maybe that was it. She was from out of state. And maybe because of the circumstances, which we'll get into, of her arrest. In any event, her truck was stopped when she was arrested. She was in the truck sleeping behind the driver's wheel. The motor was off. I don't even think there were keys in the ignition. And on the other side of the cab, the passenger's side, was a black guy who was also asleep. And it turns out he was her stable hand. She had come east with a stable hand, too, to help with the horses, to handle the horses. And they brought two horses in. And the truck was parked when she was arrested at the entrance to a big estate on the north shore of Nassau County, not far from Belmont Park. The so-called Gold Coast area, where Wall Street hedge fund guys go to sleep at night, and very fancy estates. And she was at the gateway to one estate, and she was parked near a brick column at the gate, and the column was damaged. Some bricks were smashed, and the front of her truck was also smashed in. Not completely, but, visibly. And that's when the cops came and arrested her. Well, no plea. Eventually the case come to trial, and during jury selection, before this judge, by the way, the judge lived not far from where this all took place. He lived came from a well-off family, and he lived in a very wealthy town nearby. And this lady on the prospective jury said, Judge, I don't think I can serve. Can we talk? So the judge immediately quieted her down and got her into the judge's chambers with the young prosecutor and myself. And I was a young guy, and the prosecutor's a young guy. He was a rising star, a very nice young man. He was a rising star in the Nassau District Attorney's office, and this trial was going to be something that they were counting on. They were giving him a chance to shine. And the lady tells the judge, he said, well, what's the problem? Why? She said, I don't think I can be fair as a juror. He said, well, why not? She said, well, my son was seriously injured in a collision with a drunk driver, and they've got a drunk driving charge here. And the judge says, well, I understand, but I'd like you to try to be fair. Let me tell you something about myself. My mother and my sister were in an accident. They were hit by a drunk driver. My sister was partially blinded, and my mother was killed in the accident. He said, and I have to be fair here, and I have to bend over backwards to be fair, and I'm going to do that, and I would hope you could do it. She said, I don't think I could do it. And I'm saying to myself, oh boy, am I in for a tough time. This is not going to be good. But anyway, the juror was disqualified for cause. The judge let her go, and the trial started. And the young prosecutor, as I said, was a very nice guy, very capable young man too. And he had 5 witnesses. and they were all cops. 4 of them were young patrolmen, and one of them was an older police sergeant. So he brings out the first cop, and that's the arresting officer, the guy that took credit for the whole arrest and wrote up the papers. And he told the story on direct examination, which was not good. The truck was damaged, the brick stanchion was damaged at the gate. She was at the wheel. The black guy, the stable hand, was on the other side of the truck. He did say they were asleep, and it didn't sound good. It sounded pretty bad circumstantially. The second witness, well, I asked him on cross-examination, which is a wonderful thing because if you know what you're doing, you can get another side of the story out. I did ask him. I said, well, excuse me, but was she driving the truck? At the time, he said, no, the truck was standing still. I said, were there keys in was the motor running? No. He said, the truck was standing still. I said, and were there keys in the ignition? He said, no, there weren't, that I can recall. I said, did you see her driving the truck? He said, no. I said, did you see anybody driving the truck? He said, no. I said, okay, thank you. Next witness the prosecution brings up is that arresting officer's partner, another young police officer in Nassau County. And he pretty much backs up everything the other guy said already, except he's got a little addition to his testimony. He says, well, under the front seat of the truck, we found a bottle of vodka. I said, you did? Bottle of vodka? Yeah. I says, was it full? He said, no. I said, was it empty? He said, yes. I said, did it have a cork or a cap on it? He said, no. I said, did you see anybody drink it? He said, no. I said, this lady's charged with drunk driving. Did you see her driving? He said, no, but I smelled vodka on her breath. I said, you did. And what does vodka smell like? And he come up short. Now he was looking around and he didn't know what to do. Got a gag reflex. I said, you want to describe the vodka smell? And he couldn't do it. I said, excuse me, does vodka have any smell? As far as I know, vodka's odorless. I says, it's not like scotch, rye, bourbon, whiskey of any sort. It doesn't have it, and you smelled it, but now you can't tell us what you smelled. He said, no, I can't. I said, okay, thank you. The next witness was another young cop who had responded, and this guy said, this was the guy who was the cop involved in the resisting arrest. I said, well, how did she resist arrest? He said, she kicked me in the shoulder when I tried to arrest her. I said, she did. I said, was she awake or not? He said, well, she was asleep. I tried to take her out of the truck, and she kicked me in the shoulder. I said, and where did you get kicked in the shoulder? And he showed me a spot on his shoulder, which was in the front of the shoulder. I said, and what happened? I said, did you lose work because of this? He says, yes. I said, well, how much work? He says, I was out on disability leave for 5 weeks. I said, 5 weeks? Yeah, 5 weeks? I said, I'm trying to make a point. And I'm getting a little sarcastic here because now this is rubbing me the wrong way. And also, the judge was visibly in front of the jury trying to help the young prosecutor along as he's asking questions. So I got sarcastic with the cop as a counterweight. And the judge says, I want to see both of you up here. Have a sidebar, both counsel, please. So I go up there, and he said, Mr. Greco, enough with the Brooklyn tactics, he said. You're being sarcastic with this police officer. I said, yes, Judge, and the reason why I'm being sarcastic with the police officer is you're helping the prosecutor here like he was your nephew. I says, and it's in front of the jury, and they're liable to get the impression that you really like him, that you favor him. So if you won't do that publicly, you can help him all you want privately, but if you won't do it publicly, I'll lay off the Brooklyn tactics, okay? And maybe you tell some of these cops to tell the truth here. It would be nice in the process. But he said, okay, and we made a deal. I went back. I cross-examined that cop. He was out for 5 weeks for a kick in the shoulder. And I made it, after a couple of repetitions, pretty obvious as to what's going on. Next cop up was witness number 4, was that third cop's partner. And like a good partner, he backed up his partner. He said, oh, he got kicked in the shoulder. I said, he was out for 5 weeks. Yeah, 5 weeks, I said. And I asked him if he thought that was, he says, I don't know if it's reason, but he said he was hurt and he was out for 5 weeks. I said, great. I said, was he bleeding? Did he have stitches? Did he go to hospital? No. I think he went to the hospital. Did they check any breaks, any fractures? No, bruises. I didn't see anything. So I just mitigated the whole situation. The last witness was an older cop. He was a sergeant, and he was supposedly going to be qualified as an expert. He was the guy that administered the breathalyzer exam for Pat. And he said, he's an expert. I says, on what basis are you an expert? Well, I've done this. I said, how many times have you done this? About 5,000 times over the course of my career. I says, oh, that's great. I says, well, then you really know this backwards and forwards. He says, yes, I do. I said, was this machine, when was the last time it was calibrated? When was it set up for accurate measurement? And you check the accuracy of the measurement. Uh, 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 I don't know. I said, so you don't know? You didn't calibrate it, did you? No. He said, I didn't. No, I didn't calibrate it. So you're assuming that the thing was making accurate measurements, but you didn't assure that it was making accurate. No. I said, let me ask you a question. Can outside substances register in the machine, like disinfectant or cleaning fluid or anything that mouthwash with alcohol in it? Can that affect the reading? He said, absolutely. Yeah. I said, now, anything on the outside, even in the atmosphere, if it got into the machine, can affect the reading, right? He said, yes. I said, good. So what about the clamps? He said, clamps? And he looked at me with a blank face. I said, yeah, clamps. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, you operate this machine? You don't know about the clamps? No, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, how do people breathe into the machine? He says, well, there's a mouthpiece. I said, good. And what's the mouthpiece connected to? He said, a tube. I said, and what holds the tube to the mouthpiece? He said, a clamp. I said, oh, did you check the clamp to see if it was tight or if it was loose or anything could get in there? He said, no. I said, and the tube, where's the tube connected? How's it connected to the machine? He says, oh, it sticks onto a little piece of tube that sticks out. I said, and does that have a clamp? He said, yes. I said, did you check that clamp? No. He said, I never checked any clamps. So you never checked any clamps, and you didn't calibrate this machine, and you don't know if this was loose or what else, anything else that got into the thing. No, I don't. I said, okay, thank you very much. So then I put Pat herself on the stand. I said, Pat, can you tell us, why you were sleeping in the truck there? She says, yeah. She says, I just drove all the way from California with a horse trailer with my stable hand. She says, we had to get the horse we had to get it a certain time at Belmont. She says, I'm exhausted, and we were supposed to go and I had no time. It's late. He said, we got in late with the traffic and everything else. I had no time to go to a motel or a hotel or anything like that or to make any sleeping arrangements for us, she said, and we fell asleep in the truck. I said, did anybody see you driving this truck? She said, no. I said, did you drink? She says, no. I said, there was an empty bottle of vodka. She says, that thing's been there for months. She said, I don't drink and drive. She says, I don't even remember the last time we had a drink or used that bottle or anything else. I said, did your stable hand drink or consume any alcohol? No. I said, okay. Now, they had never brought up the fact that she had consumed it or anything else. Or they never even brought up the fact of how the truck may have hit the stanchion and done the damage. And they have to prove every element. So what I did was I read the statute, the law itself, the exact wording of the statute, and I read it to the jury. And I said, there is reasonable doubt, although you can park a trailer truck in the space of a reasonable doubt in this case. We don't know who was driving. Nobody was drinking. She's drunk driving. Resisting arrest. I asked Pat on cross-examination. I said, Pat, the officer, you heard that officer say that you resisted arrest. Did you kick him in the shoulder? Did you kick him in the shoulder? She says, yes. I said, well, how did that happen? She says, I'm asleep, and I felt a hand going up my thigh, right near my crotch, she said, and I kicked as a reflex. She says, I didn't even know I was kicking. I said, was it hard? She says, no, really, it was just a reflex. I kicked him, and pretty much of a tap. It wasn't really hard. I had flat shoes on, like sneakers, and I guess I hit him, he says, I hit him in the shoulder. Okay, I hit him in the shoulder, she says, but it wasn't even hard. I said, okay, thank you. And I brought that out to the jury again on summation. And the jury went out, and I told them before they went out, I says, the first cop, I says, the arresting officer, he never saw her drive or drink. And the motor wasn't running, no key in the ignition or anything. He never saw anything happen. So despite the circumstances, we don't know nobody can say what actually happened, whether it happened before, later, or how it happened. As for the drinking, there was no drinking. The second officer found the vodka bottle. I said, the other guy got kicked in the shoulder and parlayed the whole thing to 5 weeks off at the taxpayer's expense. I said, how convenient that was. And his partner, who did what any partner would do, you would want, if he was your son, to do the same thing. He backed up his partner. I said, but that's all he did. And I said, that was weak. And as a scientific expert, was not scientific. It was sloppy. It was careless. It was anything but scientific. It wasn't expert. It was a total flub job on the breathalyzer. And I'll leave that to you jurors to decide. They came back in a half hour. The trial had lasted a week. They came back in a half hour, acquitted her of all the charges. And the judge called me into chambers, or called me, he called me up to the bench. And he said, congratulations, young man. Today you hit a grand slam home run. And I said, well, thank you, Judge. It was a fair trial. You did maintain a good atmosphere here. And all I can say is that sometimes with really hard work and a bit of skill and some experience, a defense attorney once in a while can beat the odds, but not that often. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.